All right. So I'm just going to dive right into a little presentation for you all. I'm calling it Perspectives on Sin because that's really what our tough question had to do with. And the tough question was really a two-part question. It was, what does sin really mean? And if our sins are forgiven, does it really matter if we continue to sin? So yesterday in worship, to address those questions, Emily gave a sermon about a part of Romans chapter 6. So Apostle Paul writing about this topic, and she talked about what sin really is. Well, it's what comes between us and God, what threatens to separate us from God. But we know from our faith that no such separation is ultimate because our sins are forgiven in Jesus Christ for the one who trusts in what Christ has done. And that's what we proclaim, every time we have a prayer of confession and worship and an assurance of forgiveness, we proclaim this good news. But Emily also talked about how that forgiveness is not an endpoint. It's really a beginning of a new kind of life that we're called to live, a transformed life as we follow Jesus Christ more and more. And this response to forgiveness, it's a grateful response essentially to the grace that we have received, that we live a transformed life rather than continuing to sin. So that was kind of a wrap on the sermon as I heard it. You might have heard some things that I didn't hear. I do encourage you to listen if you didn't have a chance. But, what I want to do today is to kind of go a little bit deeper on our twofold question. I would underline and put a star next to everything that Pastor Emily said. But what I want to do tonight is hear from a couple of different theologians about these matters of what sin is and what, in light of forgiveness, in light of sin and some of these other big abstract concepts, like what does that lead us to do with our lives? How are we to live? That's kind of how I hear the second question. So diving into the first part, what is sin really? We've already done this kind of shorthand of saying, well, it's what separates us from God. But as Emily pointed out, and as some of you might have been thinking and listening to the sermon, we're pretty used to thinking about sin as like a list of things that you don't want to do. And there is a basis for that we find in the Bible in certainly more than one place. There'll be lists of things that are specific good activities, things you want to do that are moral, and specific bad activities that you don't want to do because they are sinful. And I just wanted to allow that, that's a biblical basis for thinking about sin, and to take us to one of the most important texts that's like this, that gives us a sense that, well, sin is about rules and breaking rules, and that is the Ten Commandments. And this is how they appear in Exodus 20, more or less. I did not copy them out of the Bible because sometimes there's long explanations that go with them. But if you want to read these, that's where they are. They ought to be familiar, right? And these 10 commandments are the basis of all Jewish law, and they're something that we inherit as Christians. They're in the Old Testament in more than one place. And when we think about sin, I do think that we find lists like this really helpful, because when I say to you, sin is what separates us from God, or sin is something that comes between us and God, you might be wanting me to color that in just a little bit. And lists like the Ten Commandments are ways that we start to color in, okay, so like if it's something that separates us from God, like what does that look like? What does that sound like? And we get lists like this. And you'll notice, right, it's a lot of things not to do. Like just scan over the slide and look how many times you see the word not or the word no, right? And so that's part of where we get that idea. But it's not so black and white. We know as Christians, it's not that if you follow these rules, you get a gold star, and if you don't, you get a slap on the wrist. There's several reasons why we know that. But I think what we also know is that there's a spirit and a higher theology behind these rules. So even though it seems pretty black and white, there is a bit of interpretation that we need to do. And I'd like to bring a theologian into conversation with
Oh,
us,
okay, yeah.
a theologian who's meant a lot to me. His name is Robert Jensen. He wrote this incredible book called A Theology and Outline. Robert Jensen was a Lutheran theologian. He died just a couple of years ago, and he used to teach at Princeton University. And Jensen taught this class for not for seminary students at Princeton Seminary, but just for university students who wanted to learn an overview of Christian theology. And another theologian named Adam Idle turned that into this book called A Theology and Outline, Can These Bones Live? And so I just want to kind of bring him into our conversation. He's Lutheran, but much of what he's describing is commonly held throughout Western Christianity as an approach to sin. But before we can talk about sin, we have to talk about things like the Ten Commandments. We have to talk about biblical law, and not just what it says on the page, but what's the overall like ethos behind it. So Jensen taught his religion students to think about the Ten Commandments this way. They are basically describing the good life that God intends, has always intended for human beings to lead. And rather than just going over the list in his lecture, he summarizes in this particular way. He notices what these commandments really have in common. What's the spirit of these laws? And he notices that the good life that's described by the Ten Commandments does these three things. It honors God, the Creator. It's a way for us as creatures to honor the Creator. It includes religious observance. This should say familial solidarity, sexual faithfulness, respect for life, legal responsibility, and generosity to others. And you might already be thinking, those things on that list are kind of buckets, or they might include a lot of different things even beyond what we see right here. And Jensen would say that's right. Also, he notices that it's not individualistically defined, it's collectively or communally defined. So the good life that God wants for human beings, it's not just about something that I do in a vacuum. It involves God or it involves other people. As you just kind of scan through the list again, you'll notice like honor your father and your mother. If I'm a child, the way that I am called to behave involves people besides me. Um, Things like murder, adultery, stealing, bearing false witness. You can only really bear false witness against somebody else, right? So everything that God is revealing in these laws has to do with communal or collective life. And that's really important, I think, for us to notice. So he kind of boils it down to these key theological points. And I think it's helpful for us today because if you look at some of the commandments, you might be thinking, yeah, like I have to do some interpretation with this already. So if you think about the command not to have idols, or maybe you learned it as like, thou shalt not make a graven image, or, this second commandment. And I don't really know anybody in my personal life who has like a golden calf that they sit on their kitchen table and, worship before dinner every night. So this idea of worshiping idols or worshiping images, I kind of understand that it meant something different in this time and in this culture than it might mean to me now. But I can still think about and interpret that second commandment. Like I can tell, or I have a hunch when I'm worshiping or I'm starting to build my life around something that isn't God, and so I'm not in that honoring the Creator. And so some of this more open language kind of helps me translate the Ten Commandments into my own time. And so Jensen then goes from talking about the law to talking about sin, because sin is what violates this vision of the good life. And he talks about this in a couple of ways. He says sin is whatever breaks up the community. So remember, the good life is a communal life, a collective life. Sin is what breaks the community. And it usually follows, he would argue, that once we break fellowship with God, we start breaking fellowship with one another. There's something kind of like dominoes falling about that. And when we reject one another, that's also a way of rejecting God, because every single person is made in God's image. And so the cruel or harmful things that we do to one another harm God and harm ourselves, because we're not being who God made us to be. God made us to be relational. So when we break relationships, that's the first way that Jensen describes sin. He also talks about this aspect of sin that it kind of catches and holds us. So sin holds us captive. And he has this great quote. He says, if we're not bound up together with God and one another, we will be bound up in our rebellion against God, whether consciously or unconsciously. And so, whereas many of us, and Emily mentioned this in her sermon, you kind of grow up with a list of things and you say, okay, these are the things I'm not supposed to do. I know I'm not supposed to lie. I know I'm not supposed to cheat. There is something bigger at work with sin than the little things that we do. There's like a force that seems to have a hold on us. We're caught in it. It feels like something that we that we can't help. And both the Apostle Paul and St. Augustine would talk about, like, I know the good thing to do, but somehow I just like can't do it. And Jensen and many other theologians, this is quite an orthodox view, would say, well, that's sin itself. It's like knowing what the good is, but somehow not being able to choose it. It's baffling. It's confusing. There's something unconscious about it. It's like being caught in a trap. And we can't go back to a time before which sin existed. We can't get to some form of humankind where there's not sin. And that's what Augustine would come to call original sin. There's no getting back before the time that sin existed. So it's got us caught. So that's a second thing I want to kind of share with you about sin. So first, it's whatever breaks up the community. So what separates us from God, and also whatever breaks up community. And it's also what seems to be holding us captive. So the idea of original sin you might be familiar with. St. Augustine believed that sin was contagious, essentially, that it was catching from generation to generation. This is not a scientific view. He just thought that, like, when people had sex and when babies were born, like, sin was passed. I can say more about that in the Q&A if you'd like, but that was Augustine's view. More modern theologians are kind of like, I'm not sure it has so much to do with sex and childbirth, and more with the fact that, it's this issue that we all have, and then we get together and our lives interpenetrate each other. That's something that Jonathan Edwards said. So he's like, I'm a sinful person and I hang out with you and we have a shared social life. And then all of a sudden, it's like our whole social life includes sin. My alienation and your alienation get together, and all of a sudden alienation is a thing in society, alienation from God. And so this is just a kind of a quote about that. So Jensen kind of builds on the theology of Jonathan Edwards when he says the transmission of original sin seems to be more of a matter of social interconnectedness than about sex. I'm not defined by myself alone, but also by my position in the whole history of the human race. And that history is a history of alienation from the Creator and from one another. We overlap with each other. I like that verb. So we're mutually implicated in everyone else's life. So this is where it's starting to get a bit grim. So it feels like this thing we can't escape. It seems to pass between us the more we get together as social beings, and it gets worse. So at this point, I'm going to leave Robert Jensen behind. Much as I love him, I could talk about this book all day, and talk a little bit about some of Richard Rohr's recent work. So Richard Rohr has a wonderful monograph, highly recommended. I read it during quarantine. It's called What Do We Do with Evil by Richard Rohr. And Richard Rohr is a Franciscan friar and a teacher of contemplation and theology. And this is a great little book just about evil. So it's what it sounds like. And he talks about sin along the way. Sin is like this human building block of evil as it exists in the world. And one of the things that he points out, just like Jensen mentioned, like sin can be so unconscious. Richard Rohr kind of goes further and he says, it's unconscious, it exists at this widespread level, it's something we all share. And lots of times in our society, it's disguised. So he says evil is subtle, and the evils that are killing us are usually well disguised. Most people who do evil have fully explained it to themselves as good, meaning good to them, regardless of whether it is objectively good or good for society as a whole. And then he makes this really critical point, I think. Injustice, for example. So let's think about a social issue. Injustice always profits somebody. Justice is usually denied to a minority of some kind. So what Richard Rohr is talking about, how in social life, we get really used to sin and evil. We have phrases like necessary evil, where we can see that something's kind of bad, but we're like, well, we kind of need that thing. And he would argue that obviously that's complicated, but sin has great hiding places in our social life because we've kind of tricked ourselves. We've tricked ourselves into thinking, things like, murder. This is very, very vague, but like murder is bad, right? But killing people in the context of war is okay. Now, I'm not going to argue against, all war, but we have to notice the incongruity where we'll say something it's bad on the personal or individual level, or is sinful on the personal or individual level. But then sometimes when that same action is placed in the service of higher structures, we have to ask. So sin is sneaky. That's how I would put this. But the final thing I would share, and this is where we start to see the light, is that sin is human. So I think it's really important. It's this big problem that we have. We're kind of helpless in the face of. It's part of being a human being, and it's not so much about my personal failure or your personal failure, though we all know that we personally fail. But we're all just trying to validate ourselves in a really complicated world. And I love this part of the quote where he just says, sinners are just grasping for love in all the wrong places and in ways that will never work. So lots of times, whether personally or collectively or as a society, we're really trying to do our best. We're trying to find good things like safety and belonging, and kind of going about it in the wrong way. And we need help. I'm going to come to kind of a close in terms of talking about what sin is with some Presbyterian words. So I shared with you some Lutheran theology, though it's quite ecumenical, and then a little bit of Richard Rohr, which is more from a progressive Catholic perspective. This is Presbyterian. So this is a brief statement of faith written in the 1980s when the Northern and Southern Presbyterian churches were united. And you can see the part that talks about sin. It talks about this good ideal that God had for the world and for human society, making everyone equally in God's image, making diversity, male and female, every race and people. And we were made to live as one community, right? Notice that word community. So God made a good world, community that we're supposed to live in. And then this part's about sin. We rebel against God. We hide from our Creator. We actually seek separation from God, which is really sad. We do things like ignoring commandments. And when we do that, notice we violate the image of God in others and ourselves. That's what Jensen was talking about, where he says, when we turn against God, we tend to turn against each other. And that's also a way of turning against God. We damage the image of God in others and ourselves. And this is where the unconsciousness piece comes in. Look, it says we accept lies as truth. There's something about sin, we get kind of caught in it, and we stop being able to see what's really going on. And I think that can happen for individual sin, and certainly it happens for sin at a societal level. And this does harm. This does tremendous harm. And yet, God acts with justice and mercy to redeem creation. And so that's what kind of brings us into the good news, right? I skipped over one piece here, but check out what the Belhar Confession, written during apartheid, has to say about sin sometime. We can also talk about that in the Q&A.
Yes.
So if I'm hearing a little bit of echo, there might be somebody who needs to go on mute. If our sins are forgiven, does it matter if we sin? So this is the second part of what was asked in the tough question. And we all know this well. You all know this well, this idea of atonement. So if sin creates separation, what God has done in Jesus Christ is to bring things back to being one. So the word atonement actually comes from the words at one, to be at one. So things were separate, and because of Jesus Christ, they're at one. That's what the atonement really means. And there's lots of different ways of describing how that takes place. What is it about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus that heals brokenness, that ends our captivity to sin, that bridges all divisions? But it has happened. This is our faith. So there's different ways of talking about how that's accomplished, but we do know that sin has been healed. So I know that in a minute I need to come to a stopping place. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit to talk about what we do about that, right? So the whole issue with, if we've been forgiven, why can't we still sin? I think we're responding to a really very real tension in our faith, which is that we know that things are at one. We know that there's an ultimate reality where our sins are forgiven, where everything is healed, and yet we don't see it yet. I think often of this passage from the letter to the Hebrews, or from Hebrews, where these couple of verses where the author says, "Now in subjecting all things to the angels, God left nothing outside their control. As it is, we do not see everything in subjection to them, but we do see Jesus, who for a little while was made lower than the angels, now crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of his death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone." The part of that I really relate to is just, we know that things are resolved in Christ, but we don't really see that. We see Jesus, but we don't see everything on earth brought into subjection by the powers of heaven. There's trouble in this life, there's sin in this life, there's evil in this life. We just don't see fully those results. And so I think when we ask, well, why can't we sin? It's kind of saying, well, while we're waiting for this resolution and for the kingdom to come in fullness, like, why does it matter how we live? Which I think is another way of asking, just how do we live? How do we live in this time as we await the kingdom? And I think we all know the right answer, right? Like, live a good life, love people. But I think it's a worthy question. And so I'm going to pause here for just a moment, and then we can continue on kind of on that theme. Yes, okay. So I'm actually, for this small group, I'm going to go back to where we were, because we're going to get to some really fun stuff. Because, I don't know if y'all know much about the Enneagram. I'm an Enneagram 1. I like to follow rules. And so when people say things like, well, how are we to live? I'm really tempted to just I'm like, well, Jesus says, love everybody, like, figure out how to do that. Or I look back at the commandments and I go, well, you got some starting points there, right? So maybe I'm a good person to talk about sin. Maybe I'm not a great person to talk about it. But when I think about this question about, like, does it matter if we sin, or like, how are we to live as we wait for the culmination of all things, right? We have to live these lives. How do we do that? I like the right answer, But I think if it's ever been difficult for anybody in this room to kind of choose the conscious life of faith, if you've ever struggled in faith and been wondering like, why should I try to live this way of all the other ways that I could live? I want to offer just a few personal points of inspiration that I've found, and then maybe we can just talk about that. So um, this first one is humorous, but I mean it pretty seriously. So I'm a big Bob Dylan fan. Um, you may know this song. If you've been in a Bible study with me, I may have mentioned this song. I feel like I talk about it a lot, but Bob Dylan's Gotta Serve Somebody from 1979, Slow Train Coming. Um, I think it has a lot to say at a serious theological level about sin and how we are to live. So in this song, you can look it up after this meeting. Dylan like lists all these different kinds of people, and they have different occupations, and some of them are rich and some of them are poor, men and women. Some of them have very distinguished careers, and some of them have kind of unsavory work that they do. And what Dylan suggests in the chorus is that every single one of these people is going to have to serve somebody. It may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're going to have to serve somebody. And what I interpret him to mean by that is that everybody has to put their life into the service of someone, something, some set of values. Um, and it's a fact of life. And there's so many things about our lives that we can't choose. There's so many things in this life, aspects of life where we're constrained, but something that we can make a choice about, at least in some limited way, is to choose what or who we will serve. And so it's not a direct answer to the question of like, why can't I just sin? But I do think that I might respond to the question of why not sin by saying, well, what do you want your life to be about? What do you want your life to be in service to? Choose, what you will serve. And I think that, as Anthony Bloom would say, Eastern Orthodox teacher and priest, he would say, you have to choose what you're going to live for and what you'd be willing to die for. And it's a matter of the utmost importance. And so I would kind of respond with another question, I think, to the question of why not just keep sinning. There's a similar quote from Martin Luther King. If you're in my Bible study, you've seen this one before. It's from one of his sermons, a very early sermon, actually. And he just kind of says, I'm going to live a life that's about something big. I'm not going to put my faith in things. I'm not going to put my ultimate faith in gadgets and contrivances or in trends. As a young man with most of my life ahead of me, I decided early to give my life to something eternal and absolute, not to these little gods that are here today and gone tomorrow, but to God who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. I think it's a really worthwhile question in faith to ask, like, what are the little gods in my life? Like, we're all part of a church. I know you're a Christian. What are the little gods in your life? I know it's not a golden calf sitting on your breakfast table, right? But what are the things that have a claim on your allegiance? And are you conscious of that? And I think one of the answers to the question of how are we to live is like, well, the life of faith is saying, I want to be a part of something big and meaningful with God. I think choosing to try to live live a life where we follow Jesus is also just, it's not being hypocritical. I think if we say we believe in Jesus with our words, but we don't do that with our actions, that shows to other people. And I think it's also a pretty dissatisfying way to live. This is a quote from Allison Robinson, who's a Baptist minister. And she says, I'm a Christian because I don't always know if this story is true. So she acknowledges like doubt, but I choose to live my life as if it were. I choose to live as if the things Jesus died for were worthy of God's sacrifice and therefore worthy of mine. So I think part of what we're talking about here, and why not just keep sinning, is like, it's showing that you believe what you say about Jesus, and emulating Jesus and following his teachings is a clearest way to do that I know. And this is where I'm just going to close and say, This is a quote from St. Augustine that one of my first mentors in ministry used to talk about a lot. I think is just a favorite of his. As someone who could be, kind of caught up in this world, and we can all worry and get pretty stressed out. And I think it was good for him as a pastor to be reminded that really what God desires from us is just our love. And that, you know, we can run around and do all different kinds of things. But what we're really called to is just a close relationship with Jesus. And if we're moving in that direction, um, that's not the direction of continuing to sin. The closer we get to Jesus, I think the more those things fall away. So there's an invitation to love, which we have from Christ, that I think is the most important argument. I love this little statue of Jesus and the beloved disciple, just leaning on him. So that's where I'm going to stop and just kind of open it up. Any questions that you all have? I'd love to hear.